Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to see such a full room as well. I can see it's a really important topic for all of you. I'm Lucy Brown, I work for Mercer. I lead our DEI and pay equity and pay transparency consulting business, supporting clients locally, regionally and globally in this space. And so we're going to talk around how the drive for reward transparency is shaping global pay strategies. So if we think around how we got here, why are we talking around pay transparency? There's four kind of key drivers that we're seeing. The first is the proliferation of data on social sites. When we think of the likes of Glassdoor, PayStart, Indeed, LinkedIn, employees and future candidates can get a whole wealth of information at their fingertips. Now, whether that compensation information or their feelings on culture are accurate, it's out there for people to see. And so if you're not controlling the narrative, there's a risk that that data is misconstrued or like I say, it's not representing you fairly. The second piece is around this shift in societal and employee expectations. We're seeing a real change generationally. Studies show that Gen Z are 90% more likely to talk around pay at work versus older generations where maybe it was written into the employment contract that they couldn't even discuss pay. So real changes there that we also need to try and navigate. We're seeing a drive on social sustainability. We've got the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU. That's driving conversations around fair pay, living wages, and the sustainability of these over time. And then last but not least, we couldn't talk around this without mentioning legislation. We'll touch very briefly on the EU directive, but of course, there's lots of transparency legislation across the world that will be driving these conversations in your organizations. Mercer, every 2 years, run our global talent trends, and what we're seeing is that actually fair pay is the number 2 reason why employees are staying at a firm, second only to job security. 2 years ago, it was number 4, it's now number 2. So we're seeing that this is really becoming an increasing focus, and what I think is really interesting is that competitive rewards is number 6. So it's actually this focus on fairness as opposed to competitiveness when employees are thinking around their pay. We're also seeing that of employees that believe that they're paid fairly, they're twice as likely to understand how their compensation is calculated, twice as likely to be provided with pay range information, and they're more engaged and more committed to the organisation. So the benefits are really strong there from both perspectives. We're also seeing more data that's showing that around 1 in 2 employees and candidates are unlikely to apply for a job if compensation information is missing off that job posting. So when we're all struggling to attract and retain, top talent, diverse talent, this could be the difference between you having that bigger pool or not. So before we dive in, I always want to set the scene and make sure we're all speaking the same language, that we've all got the same knowledge. So just very briefly to cover some very quick definitions when we're talking around this. When we're talking about pay gap reporting, that is typically more based on compliance, so the average pay gaps between males and females both across an organisation, but also potentially across categories of worker, so more equal pay gap reporting. It's typically driven by compliance in the likes of Europe, for example, we have it there. When we're talking about pay transparency, this is more, what is someone paid, how are they paid it, why are they paid it, both in the context of the organisation, but also in the wider market and the performance of the economy and how does that impact my pay. The last thing is pay equity. This is sometimes used to talk around fair pay and fairness, and it certainly is about ensuring fair pay, particularly on a gender-neutral or race and ethnicity-neutral basis. But actually, when Mercer, we talk around pay equity, we're specifically talking about robust regression analysis to try and do that at a much deeper level than just typical pay gap reporting. We're not really going to touch around that today, but it is something we support clients with. So, per the original point around legislation is driving a lot of these conversations. If we think around how it's showing differently across the different regions, in the UK we currently only have pay gap reporting. It's expected with this new government that that's going to move towards ethnicity and disability reporting, but we're not necessarily talking around pay transparency locally yet. In the United States and Canada, based on different states, different cities, we're seeing that there's increasing pay transparency legislation there. In Europe, we've had pay gap reporting, but very varied across different countries. And now we've got this new EU directive coming in on pay transparency and equal pay. In APAC, we've got some pay gap reporting, and in Latin America, there hasn't been much attention here, but it's increasing, particularly with the likes of Brazil that are introducing it. So even if we just look at this slide and you're thinking around, if you work for a global organization, each region's doing this differently. So actually trying to create a global strategy takes a lot of work, and it's not an easy job, and it's going to be a journey if that's what you choose to do. So I'll just very quickly give you the headlines on the EU directive. I'm sure some of you may be more familiar than others, but the EU directive came into force in June 2023, and each member state of the EU now has until 2026 to implement this into their national law. That will mean that the first reporting will likely be 2027, based on 2026 data, but there's no reason why it couldn't come into effect sooner, so worth noting that. There are two parts to the directive. The first part is around pay transparency. This impacts any footprint that you have in the EU. So any legal entity in the EU, regardless of size, you will be required to publish pay range information on job adverts, provide some transparency around pay and career progression, and it all needs to also be underpinned by a gender-neutral, robust job evaluation structure. When we're talking around equal pay, employees can also request information around their pay range and where they sit. The other part to this is the equal pay piece. This is driven by the headcount of your legal entities in the EU, particularly sort of 100 employees and above. But depending on what year you have to start and how frequently you have to do it, it's a bit of a sliding scale. But that will be the requirement to do overall pay gaps, but also those equal pay gaps based on category of worker, which means you need to define categories of worker, which can be a job in itself. But if then you're spotting any gaps that are greater than 5%, these need to be understood why and remediated if there are no objective factors to explain why this gap exists. Now, a couple of things to note here in particular is around the definition of pay that's being used. It's all-encompassing, so that includes basic salary, allowances, bonuses, and benefits as well. And for a lot of organisations, being able to value benefits at an individual employee level is going to be a real challenge in thinking around how to do that. So, yeah, if anyone joined the Mercer Marsh Benefits benefit workshop breakfast this morning, you may have seen a bit more around that. But there's lots of conversation around what even counts as a benefit. And if we think about this, when we think around benefits, where we get our data from for our employees, we often have multiple systems. Where are you getting all this data from? Can you rely on it? Does it just do it at a kind of group cost level? Can you see it at individual level to value it? Likewise, we've all introduced a lot of employee choice now around flexibility. Do I want a car or for the allowance, or do I want the cash? Or how do I want to spend maybe the flexible benefits fund if I have one? So then how do we account for that in the calculations? And then sometimes benefits don't necessarily have a clear value. If you think around life insurance, do we value that at the cost of the premium, or do we value it based on how much it could pay out one day? It raises lots of questions, and this is where, for my team, the benefits experts come in to help with that. But it's going to involve some thinking, and it's not going to be an easy kind of process to do this. And pragmatism is going to be key in order to get this right. Now, we're doing a lot of research in this space, and we're seeing that a lot of organisations are sort of falling into three categories when they're thinking around pay transparency. You've got those that are defined maybe more as resistors. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not doing anything in this space, but potentially are still focused on prioritising confidentiality, focusing on those minimum compliance requirements that they have, and just working towards meeting those, which, that's a good start, that's great to do. The second is around transformers. So these are realising, there are real benefits to doing pay transparency. How can we prepare on our journey, mitigate those risks, but actually maybe aim a little bit higher than just compliance? And then lastly, we've got some leaders, so those that are pioneers in this space that are actually integrating transparency into their values of the company, not just being transparent on pay, but what else can we be transparent around, and how can we really reflect that to employees and future candidates as well. So maybe start to think around where you think your organisation fits in this, and is that where you want to be, and do you need to create some more buy-in with stakeholders around the topic? As I said, we've done a lot of research in this space. We've got a global pay transparency report, which you've got the QR code here, and you'll get the slides afterwards. But what we're seeing is that there's some lots of interesting statistics there I'm going to cover just in a moment. However, on the tables, there's a copy of the UK pay transparency report as well, because I appreciate that some of you may just be UK focused. The UK isn't subject to any of this compliance, and so what we're seeing still is that there's a lot of pressure for UK employers, just from peers that may have a broader footprint, but also from those employee and candidate expectations. They're sort of starting to expect to see this too. So there's more of those. I'll make sure that that's it's on our stand, the Mercer Marsh Benefits stand. It's number 17. You can have a look. So if we look at the global results, what we're seeing is that, companies are really aware of the expectations in this space. They know that transparency is an expectation of candidates, and they know that it's an expectation of their employees. However, are they ready? Not so much yet. 1 in 2 companies in Europe are currently developing a strategy and an approach to doing pay transparency. But 28% have not started yet, but they will start in the next 12 months. And 26% say that they're prepared for the global pay transparency requirements. It's worth testing that and seeing, really, have they got the end-to-end process yet, or have they just kind of planned the approach that they're going to have? If we have a think around how companies are approaching pay transparency, we're seeing that of those that have confirmed their approach, around 1 in 2 are striving to have some form of global minimum standard. And I think this is potentially important and something to try to aspire for, to really create that consistent employee experience across your organisation if you have global reach. If an employee moves from one country to another, do they get the same transparency that they've had? And is that messaging consistent from wherever the source of information is coming from? We're seeing that around 24% are doing a country-level approach, so more localised. We work with a lot of decentralised organisations, so that can still work, but just ideally having some kind of oversight across that to create cost efficiency, resource efficiency, and consistent messaging. A smaller number are looking at it literally properly globally, and 11% are looking at it regionally. But from the companies I'm working with, I actually see that that's more of a preference, because at least capturing Europe is a little bit easier than trying to cover the whole of the world at this point in time. When we're looking at how companies are approaching the field of pay transparency, we're seeing, interestingly, a bit of an even split between those that want to go beyond compliance in a sort of standardised way across the firm, internally and externally, and those that just want to meet the compliance requirements that they have. So no matter where you might sit, you'll probably find some organisations are also thinking similarly. But it's worth noting, like I say, 28% still don't have a defined approach. When we have a look at what companies are sharing, we're seeing that the majority are really focusing still on just sharing pay philosophy, pay policies, maybe target incentives. But when it comes to sharing pay ranges and pay gaps, particularly adjusted pay gaps, so that's when you've accounted for all the objective factors to actually understand how much of the pay gap is unexplainable, we're seeing that those numbers are much lower. We asked what the key drivers for pay transparency is for an organisation, and we're seeing that, no surprise, compliance really is the number one driver. But what's interesting as well is that we're seeing, alignment with company values, or DEI strategy is up there. We're seeing aligning with candidate expectations and actually enhancing the employer brand too. There are lots of other really valuable reasons for thinking around this. And when we also asked what were the challenges that organisations were having, I thought what was really interesting is that the top 3 or 4 are actually human elements. They're worried that employees don't understand their compensation. They're worried that managers don't have the capability to have these conversations. You know, we all think we're fantastic and we should be at the top of a pay range. Is a manager prepared to tell you slightly differently? Likewise, getting leaders on board and that buy-in, particularly around the urgency of why now. If you are subject to EU legislation, like I say, it's based on 2026 data, which means if you want to make any changes in the pay cycle, you've got to do it in 2025, which means actually you need to do the analysis now. You know, so that's how we want to kind of get those leaders on board. Now, it's not to say there's other drivers, you know, resource challenges is also tricky. This is a big project and it puts a lot of pressure on HR, and it shouldn't necessarily just sit with them. Local teams need to really get involved to support, and it's a wider piece, which we'll come on to in a moment. Because if we think around the audiences here, and this is where the comms strategy really becomes important. You know, you've got HR who are going to be this coach to the rest of the organisation, sort of giving guidance on how this is going to work. But you've got leaders who need to be this storyteller. They need to be able to have this consistent message that's going out to employees that helps them to understand why you're doing this. Managers, they're the implementers. Like I say, they've got to have those difficult conversations in order to actually implement what's happening. And then you've got employees. They're receiving so much information from many different sources, not just the leaders and the managers and HR, but the people they sit next to. Like I say, some of those social sites. So how do you make sure that what they receive is consistent? And then lastly, candidates. They're seeking information. They want to know what's going on. Often we're doing a lot more internally than we share externally. So how do you actually use that to your advantage to make a positive story for candidates? And then even more sort of audiences, you've got the unions and the works councils that might get involved, particularly for the EU directive. You've got recruiters who want to know what you're offering so they can bring in the right candidates. Shareholders, the media, the government who you might be reporting into. You know, it's a big project, and so the comms piece really makes sure that that change management works, and that everyone knows what they need to know and what they should know and what they want to know. So when we're thinking around the journey to pay transparency, like I say, it's a journey. There's lots of steps here. You're not going to solve it overnight. That's okay. Everyone's in a similar place. The first step really is around assessing your readiness. Do the foundations that you have in place now, you know, do they work? Are they fit for purpose? If we think around your job architecture, is that sufficiently robust to rely on to then move into sharing pay ranges and information there? Is your pay philosophy like robust and supportive of how you want to compensate people? Do you do any pay gap analysis? Do you go as far as doing pay equity analysis? Are managers ready to have these conversations? You can then step into actually what's your vision? How transparent do you want to be? And how are you going to communicate that? And what leaders do you need to get brought into that? And then moving into planning for that journey of, well, what are the steps you need to do to get there? Do you need a new HRIS system to make sure all this data is in one place? Do you need to take inventory and value your benefits? Do you need to close some pay gaps before you want to share them? Then moving into sharing your story, like I say, that's the communications piece of what are you going to share, how are you going to do it? And lastly, how are you going to measure the impact? We often find that you know, if we want to get this to be successful, we need to actually have metrics to look at this. So are you seeing increased applicants? Are you seeing improvements in how employees perceive their pay and employee listening results? Are we seeing reduced turnover and things like this? So we do pay transparency readiness assessments where we deep dive into policies and processes. However, we also have this free checklist tool if you want to just do a little benchmark and see where you are now against some peers and how ready you are from a variety of different audience perspectives as well. So it's something like 36 questions. You're welcome to fill that in and eventually get a benchmark report there. That looks at sort of the 4 pillars of job architecture, pay equity, policy, people, and culture. And with that, I just want to summarise before we open for questions. that pay transparency is not a passing fad, it's going to be here to stay. You need to be honest about the strength of your foundations now, understand what your different audiences need to know, set that strategy and make sure it's being communicated clearly and consistently across your locations, and take a long-term approach. Like I say, it's not an overnight task.